Today is one of those transitional Sundays in the church calendar. It's the last Sunday of Epiphany, that season that we have since Christmas. It's also the last Sunday before Lent. So Lent starts this week. So this is one of those Sundays when we start to move from one season to another. And it's on this Sunday, the Sunday before Lent, we always hear that reading, the gospel reading, the story of the transfiguration. That rather enigmatic story of Jesus going up the mountain with his disciples and being transfigured before them. It's a very important story. We know that because it's in all three gospels, the Matthew, Mark and Luke, the three gospels that can be seen together. And in each of those gospels it comes in the same place. It's always right in the middle of the gospel. And just as this is a transitional Sunday for us, so in the gospels this is a transitional story. It's a hinge, pivotal moment in the gospel story. It comes, as I say, in the middle of the gospels, just after Peter has for the first time recognized Jesus as the Messiah. That key moment when his identity is finally revealed to the disciples. Then in all of those three gospels, straight after that, Jesus starts to talk about the fact that he's going to go to Jerusalem, that he's going to suffer, be crucified, and then raised again to life. He hasn't embarked on that part of his teaching before Peter recognizes him as Messiah. So Peter recognizes him. He teaches for the first time about his impending suffering and his trip to Jerusalem. And then, and we know it was 6 days later because it says in the text, in all three Gospels, 6 days later, there's the story of the transfiguration. And all those three little stories are the pivotal moment in the Gospel, where it goes from focusing on Jesus' teaching to focusing on his death and the events of the last week in Jerusalem. And as I say, it's an enigmatic, slightly mysterious story. It's a challenging story, partly because it doesn't in many ways seem to fit with the rest of the gospel. So I'm going to try to make sense of it by picking out three phrases that we see in our gospel reading set for the day. The first is a phrase that only Matthew includes. I've said that all three gospel writers, the three that can be seen together, have this story. They all have slight differences. Something that's unique to Matthew is the detail about Jesus' appearance. Only in Matthew do we read this. And Jesus was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun. His face shone. Only Matthew gives us that detail. And clearly, Matthew wants to include that detail about Jesus' face shining, as it links with the Old Testament story that we heard read about Moses. Because Moses too went up a mountain, and the cloud descends with the glory of God, and that's where he gets the 10 Commandments. And as that story goes on, we realize that when he came down from the mountain, his face shone too for a while, and he had to put a veil over his face because the people couldn't bear to look at him. But there's a significant difference. There are similarities. There's a key difference. Moses' face shone with the reflection of God's glory. The glory of God was in the cloud, and Moses' face reflected that glory. In Jesus' case, he's not reflecting God's glory. That glory is within him. And what the disciples are seeing is something not reflected in Jesus, but embodied in Jesus. As the epistle said, Peter says, we've been eyewitnesses to his majesty, to his glory. That the divine aspect of his nature. We've just seen that, says Peter. And that's a big difference. And we see that in the story reflected in what happens with the clouds. In Moses' case, the cloud comes down and covers him, and then he reflects God's glory. In the gospel story of the transfiguration, Jesus' glory, his majesty that is within him, is revealed before the cloud appears. The cloud comes afterwards, because Jesus doesn't need to reflect God's glory and majesty. He embodies it. It's within him. And how shocking and disturbing it must have been for the disciples to witness this transfiguration. No wonder we're told that they were overcome by fear. Until this part of the story in the gospel, until his transfiguration, they'd known Jesus as a teacher, a healer, someone they'd been with for 3 years. They knew him well. He was a traveling companion. They knew his voice, his face, his manners. He was familiar to them. Then one day, high up on a mountain, this unimaginable thing happens. And before their very eyes, Jesus is changed. They see a different aspect to him. This glorious, magnificent, majestic aspect that they hadn't seen before. Suddenly Jesus was other to them. And there's a lesson here for us too, that just when we think we've got God sorted, that we've understood God's ways, that we've got God in whatever cultural, social box we ever want to put him in, God is always bigger than any box we might want to contain him in. Whenever we think we've known God, there's always more to know, always more to his glory and to his majesty that bursts out of any constraints that we or any church might seek to box him in with. It's good to be brought to our knees occasionally by the realization that God's ways are not our ways, and that when we think we've understood God, there's always more. Our God is a God of surprises. It's sometimes a wonderful thing to encounter Jesus on the mountaintop. And what happens to the disciples in this story is they catch a glimpse of who Jesus really is. They catch a glimpse of his glory and his majesty. In 2011, I went to the wedding of Kate Middleton and Prince William. When I say I went to the wedding, what I mean is I slept on the sidewalk outside Buckingham Palace, and I was there the night before the wedding, and I actually had a very good night's sleep, much to my wife's annoyance. But what it meant was that we were on the front row when the procession came past, from when they were married in Westminster Abbey to when they were having the celebrations in Buckingham Palace. We were there on the front row. It was a magical moment when they went past, in all the pomp and the ceremony. And some of you might think, well, that's crazy. Why would you spend an uncomfortable night on a sidewalk when you could watch the whole proceedings at home in the comfort of your own living room? But let me tell you, it was worth for me every moment. I don't regret it. And I left leaving how wonderful it was. I never thought afterwards, oh, I wish I'd gone to the reception. Or it would have been nice to have actually been in the Abbey. Just catching that glimpse was enough. And I say this because we, like the disciples, are only ever granted a glimpse of God's glory, of his majesty. And we need those glimpses if we're to be sustained in the journey of faith. I had a very good friend of mine who came to faith in university, and he actually ended up going to seminary for a year or so. And then he gave it all up and said that he became an atheist. And I asked him why. He said, well, I've read all the right books, I've done all the right things, but I've never had a sense of God's presence. And couldn't carry on. He couldn't carry on being a Christian without that. And I think we all need that sense of God's presence with us from time to time, a glimpse of his glory. My friend never had that sense of glimpse that would have sustained him throughout a Christian life. We need those mountaintop moments, even if they don't happen very often or they don't last very long. It is amazing how profound it is just to have a fleeting glimpse of God's reality, of his majesty, of his presence with us. The second phrase I notice is when Peter says, in response to this great vision, it is good for us to be here. We have this great privilege of coming together, of worshipping in a beautiful building freely. It is very good for us to be here. There are many places in the world where people can't gather to worship God in freedom. And I want to say something about our new organ, which I think makes it even better for us to be here. And I have a Lenten challenge I'd like to share related to the organ. I was praying with one of the Psalms this week, and I was struck by this verse. Let all who take refuge in you rejoice. Let them ever sing for joy. And I want to suggest, as I always do every year, that rather than giving something up for Lent, we take something on. And this year, one of the things I suggest we might take on is singing. If it's not your custom to sing in church, then this Lent is the ideal time to give it a try. Something happens to us when we sing. We're engaged at a deeper level. Our emotions are stirred. I can speak from personal experience because the first hymn we sang today, we sang at our wedding 31 years ago. And as I came down the aisle singing it, my emotions were stirred, bringing back those happy memories. And our new organ is wonderful in many ways. One of the things it's wonderful is that it's designed to support our singing. That's what you get in a great organ that's built for a church. This, it's not a performance organ, this. It's a church organ that comes and lifts our singing and supports our singing. It's different to that dreadful electric organ we had for a year or two before this, where the sound came at you. It was just a loud noise coming at you. If you listen to this organ, it's much gentler. It speaks to us in our bellies. It helps us to sing. It's there to support us. It's easier to sing with. So there's a Lenten challenge for you. I want to look out and see a congregation full of people singing. And I've been told by our organ people who've been here this week that they're encouraged by the noise you already make, that you are a good singing congregation. So let's get even better in this Lenten season. And one final point on this subject: if you're shy of singing, don't worry, because nobody can hear you. Not only are you probably sitting quite a way, if you're sitting near someone, the chances are they've heard you singing somewhere else in the shower or something. And otherwise, there's a lot of people here to make a noise. Our organ makes a big noise. You can lose your voice in the sound of our choir, the congregation, and the organ. It is good for us to be here. And it's not just in church that we can enjoy the company of God and the joy that comes with that. Jesus came off this mountaintop and accompanied the disciples down the mountain. We can know God's presence with us in the valley moments, not just in the mountaintop moments. Jesus is with us always. We worship God who travels with us. I knew a woman once who typed out this phrase and she put it on her mirror in the bathroom. So every morning when she brushed her teeth, the first thing she saw was that phrase: it is good for us to be here. Finally, I want to have a word about what the voice from the cloud says in this reading. This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him. Listen to him. The world is a noisy place, full of so many distracting and misleading voices. It's good to be reminded of the need to be silent, listening to the voice of our Creator listening to Jesus. Our prayers aren't just made up of words. Of course, there's a sense in which when we bring our prayers to God, we make our requests, we make our intercession. We come with a shopping list. But that's not the end of prayers. Could be the beginning, it's not the end. A key part of any prayerful life is being quiet, of being silent, of listening to God, of seeking his voice. And from my own experience, that's not easy. And when I get to that quiet place, what helps me is I read a psalm. I read a psalm every day. I just read it slowly. I read it quietly. I might just alight on a phrase and think, well, what's that phrase saying to me? I might make that phrase into a prayer. Then I might just get it down to one word that I just repeat quietly in my head. And that leads me into a place of quiet, where I can be listening and receptive. And in my experience, I hear the voice of God most clearly when I'm quiet and reading the Bible slowly. And sometimes just a verse comes through, a verse comes alive. And I think, yeah, there's something there that I need to listen to. That's God's Spirit prompting me as I read this text. Prayer is not just about seeking to change God's mind. It's opening ourselves up to the possibility that we too might be changed by God's Spirit at work in us. So there's another possible Lenten challenge. We could practice being quiet with God. Let's seek God this Lent and pray that we might be granted a glimpse of his glory. Amen.